Today, we are covering the topic of streamlining biotech research with data and lab automation. We will be talking a lot about these topics, and I want to start with some housekeeping. And like I mentioned earlier, we have a packed webinar today, lots of things to discuss. So I'm going to go straight into it after we cover the housekeeping things. So first of all, the webinar today will start with a guided discussion with the panelists with some very key important ideas that we want to cover first to lay the background. And then we're going to try to leave as much room as possible we have to go into the audience Q&A. So make sure throughout the process, make sure to leave your questions in the Q&A box in Zoom. And we will try, we'll definitely try our best to get to all the questions at the end. They will be answered during the audience Q&A segment. That's also the time when we open a chat for a more open discussion with the panelists and the audience. So again, make sure to leave your questions to the Q&A, and we'll get to that at the closer after we finish the guided discussion. We will also, give me 1 second. We will also be recording this webinar. So the webinar recording will be available next week. So watch out for the webinar recording emails next week. And lastly, there's a post-webinar survey that we would like everyone to fill out at the end of the webinar. This will really help us to know what topics to cover in the future, know your experience down the road, and so we can improve our webinar experience down the road. So I will really appreciate everyone if you can take a few. It's a very short webinar survey, so we'll really appreciate it if you can take a little bit of time to fill this survey. All right. And next, I do have to do an obligatory SciNote mention. If you don't know SciNote yet, SciNote is a digitalization company. We have the mission to really help the humanity benefit the most from science, and really to save the research data for future generation. And that's very important to us and to our dear to our heart. So our lab notebook, electronic lab notebook, is a leading ELN with inventory compliance and team management tools. It's actually used by, a lot of biotech labs, academia institutions, and also government agencies, including FDA and USDA. And we recently launched our new SciNote mobile app. The EON mobile app will help you document information at the bench that will sync real time with our web application. So if anyone's interested, we'll have contact information at the end of the webinar. So make sure to reach out to us if you're interested in this. All right, that's all the housekeeping stuff I need to cover. We're now going to introduce our speakers today. So first of all, I would like to introduce Matjaž Hren. Matjaž is the VP of Product Management at SciNote. He started out, his digitalization journey started out as a researcher with a PhD in biotechnology before turning toward entrepreneurship and co-founded Biosystemica, which is a biotech company. That's also where SciNote actually spun off from. Now he leads the product development team at SciNote, helping scientists digitize data in the lab for the future. All right, next we have Ellen. Oh, sorry about that. Let me go back. Next, we have Ellen. Ellen is the founding scientist at Ganymede with a background in tissue engineering and a PhD from Columbia University. He's an expert in preclinical drug development, oncology, and bioinformatics. Now he drives the commercial teams at Ganymede Bio and heads marketing efforts in the world of biotech innovation. Perfect. I should also mention that Ganymede Bio is a whole lab automation and data integration platform. All right, and next we're gonna meet Ginger Cooper. She has the best title I've ever seen. Her title is Robot Princess. Ginger is the Robot Princess of lab automation, and with over 20 years of experience in automation in the lab automation industry, starting from field application, custom automation systems to now the Robot Princess at Artificial, a digital lab software provider. She has a passion for automating and digitizing labs. So that's Ginger, right? And next we have Eric Robbibaro. Eric is the Southwest Sales Manager at Biosero. He's an automation specialist in the fields of industry and life sciences. With an electrical engineering background, he believes in the fusion of engineering and business. And this is something that I really like about Eric's style. He believes that when those two fields come together, there's no obstacle that cannot be overcome and no process that cannot be optimized or improved. And he uses his knowledge to recommend complex automation solutions to users who need the support. All right. Thank you all the web panelists for joining us today. So we're going to start with a question on automation, which is, when I first started planning this webinar, Elle and I had a little discussion about, lab automation and data automation. So I want to start with defining it a little bit better and talk about their benefits. So exactly what are these two automations? Like, where do they overlap? What exactly do they cover? And what kind of benefits do we usually see when it comes to automation?
Sure, I guess I can chime in. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to everybody joining us today. I think I speak for all of us here when I say that one of our primary goals is to leverage our expertise in software towards making what I like to call at Ganymede 10x scientists. And I think one powerful way to accomplish that is by enabling automation in the lab. It's actually a bit ironic because automation has all these robotic connotations, but I think in reality, it's meant to empower us as people and as scientists. I think most of the benefits of automation, probably pretty obvious, time savings. So no one got into the life sciences to pipette endlessly or drag and drop files into the cloud or, copy paste from your Excel into your ELN. You're kind of passionate about designing elegant experiments, being able to really dive in deeply into your data and analyze it and gain new insights. I think another benefit is, of course, increased scale and productivity. You can run through many more experiments, generate tons of new data, try to get through those insights. And I think that especially becomes important in the life sciences now, as I think, especially on the therapeutic side, a lot of the low-hanging fruit have been picked, and we kind of have to dive deeper and deeper into more refined areas of expertise. Some of them, though, are less obvious on the benefits side, but I think just as important. So there's a certain level of standardization that comes with automation, and that's a bit of a double-edged sword. Maybe we'll talk about later in the webinar. And that standardization will yield higher reproducibility. And that's kind of the linchpin of any successful biotech or life sciences endeavor or scientific endeavor. And it's something that's often kind of overlooked. People are usually focused on the how do I scale things up side of things. But you have to maintain both quality and quantity, right? It's a growing biotech. And I think in terms of actually implementing automation, right, now that we've talked about the benefits, implementing it successfully in the lab, I think it's necessary to have this mentality of assembling the right tech stack, or maybe a simpler way of looking at it is layers of software and hardware. I personally kind of see it as an automation sandwich, especially with the crowd we have here today on the panel. I'll kind of discuss what I mean by that. So I think, the top and bottom layers, you can see there's systems of record, things like ELNs and LIMS. We are kind of generating, annotating these new experiments, kind of keeping track of your analyzed results, maybe at the bottom, right? Next, you may incorporate design of experiment systems. So things like Synthase, they allow you to kind of lay out your experimental plans in a very comprehensive way, make sure you have all of your variables covered and the steps in the process defined. And then you have your lab automation layer to your question. That's probably the thickest. It's historically the most well-developed. This usually involves the actual execution of the experiments and reactions. And it's where your automation hardware and robotics like liquid handlers and digital orchestration platforms like Biosero and Artificial have expertise. And then once you've run your actual experiments, next up is the data layer. So that's where platforms like Ganymede, I think, thrive in applying automation to your data, to all of your analytical data. And this, includes automatically pulling it off of analytical instruments like flow cytometers, storing and structuring that data in the cloud, enabling you to, automate some of your analysis, certainly automate the data entry back into the right place, back into your ELN and LIMS, kind of that bottom of that sandwich. So hopefully that gives you a nice overview.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Alan. That's an excellent overview. And so we're going to kind of build our discussion based on those definitions and kind of understanding, that's sort of the background layer that we're looking at. Does anyone has anything else they would like to chime in before we move on to the next topic? If everything's good, we're going to start with that kind of foundation of, understanding automation. And we're going to go into the next one, which is automation used to give people a very kind of hardware, robotic arms, things in a very clean like lab environment. You see pictures of those automation environments. And it's starting to shift a little bit these days when we see more, like platforms, more, accessible options, not just, hardware automation, but more like on the software, on the data side. So part of the curiosity is how that shift, happened, or what is the reason behind that kind of shift to make things more accessible. And for this one, Ginger, can you kind of share your thoughts with us?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So, like you mentioned, right, we have hardware. When you think of automation, you think hardware. And I think, at least from what I see, is that, from a hardware perspective, we have what we need for the science today, right? And now it's about getting the most out of those tools we have via digitization. And the larger the data sets are from just your evolution of science in general, right? The more we need the software and the platforms. We didn't have these large data sets 20 years ago when I was selling plate readers and stuff for high throughput screening, right? The data sets were not as large as they are now. And we didn't have that need. So with sequencing, next gen, genomics, cell analysis, precision medicine, all of that, the data sets are just larger. So we need platforms to not only analyze, but then begin to truly look at the scientific workflow holistically. Alan kind of touched on this, about automation as, automation, but everything was really looked at in silos, right? You had your hardware automation, you had your manual, you had your analysis, and everything was separate. And with all the different platforms as well, right? To solve those unique problems, and nothing was looking at everything holistically. As an aside, I remember the first time, I think it was UCSF was building out Mission Bay. And one of the things that was innovative at the time was one of the buildings that they built, each quad, if you will, was going to be a different scientific modality. And the innovation was the fact that they were all going to meet in the middle so that all the different scientists could talk to each other. And I kind of see that evolution with the data automation that we have now, right? Where like your manual, your data analysis, and your automation are all starting to talk with each other. With all of these software platforms that are coming into play, you have artificial, you have, Ganymede, you have SciNote, you have Biosero, and HiRes even all starting to get into this now. And so I think, data drives it. We have the hardware, and then now it's just about optimizing what we have.
That's a great kind of a coverage on transition. And I think, Matjaž, do you have anything else to add to this point?
Yeah, maybe also to add to Alan's point, actually. So when we're talking about the automation, we should not, forget that people, so humans, are also part of that. So we are driving, we are, responsible for generating data and consuming this as well. So maybe it's just a kind of a philosophical thing, but that's the purpose, right, of automation, is to make our lives easier.
Right. Humans are always a factor, even in an automated environment. The human behind as well are always a big factor when it comes to even things like, especially things like implementation and the adoption of the tool. Alan, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think certainly, as with most technologies, the costs are coming down. That's kind of a major trend that's happening. Both, I think, as a result of refinements to the hardware. So like Open Transist Flex kind of recently came out. Their kind of focuses on, introducing automation into your lab at a smaller stage, right? I would kind of, having built out sort of automation systems at life sciences companies and medical institutions, I would really recommend kind of taking that route, versus I think where a lot of these efforts become very complicated is when you have all these manual workflows and then suddenly you're trying to shift these massive workflows over into an automated setting. Kind of starting off small and taking that piecemeal approach is one thing that I think is kind of evolving within this space. So.
That sounds great. That's a very nice kind of cover on the landscape of automation overall. And if everyone's good with that, I'm gonna shift to the next kind of a topic that we're kind of a question that we have. So up next is, so now we talk about automation, we talk about, the definition, we talk about kind of like, okay, so how is shifting? to very data, focusing on a lot of focus on data and a lot of focus on, the software, how to get, hardware is there, like how to get things to talk to each other. Well, what are the common challenges when it comes to and we talk actually a little bit about human, being this part of the equation. What are some common challenges when it comes to implementing those solutions or implementing those kind of automation in the lab? And are there, strategies to address those? And for this question, I think I'm gonna see if Eric, you have anything to chime in here. I know you have worked with a lot of complex solutions, and you have interact with a lot of robotics group as well. So yeah, so if you can share your thoughts with us.
Absolutely. So one of the benefits of working with people at different stages in the process, whether that's really small scale or these massive biofactories, is that you get to see some of the hurdles that they face at those different stages. So one of the common challenges just up front is getting your stakeholders on board. And that's not necessarily just the person that you report to or a lab manager. That can be everyone in the company, as far as the legal ramifications of having collaborative robotics and different programs running on your system. Your IT department, who is often overlooked, but is a crucial factor when it comes to integrating a fully automated system or software suite. And then beyond that, I think that getting a picture of what you want to accomplish from automation over a long period of time. So it's not something, the goal is not to buy a piece of automation, let it get obsoleted in a few years, and then toss it out for a new one. I think that with everyone present, whether that's Biosero, Artificial, or Ganymede, the goal is this long-term scaling up and being able to grow, not necessarily organically, but grow at a rate that makes sense for the company and for the process. And the key to that is finding really collaborative partners in the space. And so the names that I just mentioned are great opportunities, but there are countless companies out there that want to partner with customers and partner with firms and make sure that that vision is realized, not necessarily as a quick project that will be over in a year, but something that can span, 2, 3, 5, sometimes even 10 years to get to goal. And that's really what I think is lost in the initial discussions, or when people get really excited about automation, but don't think of the long-term ramifications or that long-term strategy.
That's a great point, actually, looking at long term. And I think that's looking for partnership. I think that's really critical too, especially when all these players in place. Alan, do you have anything to add to this point?
Yeah, so I mentioned kind of earlier that standardization is that double-edged sword. So the other side of it is actually the challenging side, right? Being able to pick the right workflows, make sure that they do lend themselves well to automation. That's been a pretty big challenge we've seen kind of across the board. Sometimes I think companies, they'll jump on the sort of bandwagon of automation, similar to digital transformation or AI or ML. It's kind of buzzwords as this magic bullet that will kind of solve their problems or allow them to scale exponentially and be successful. And they often will misapply them, and they're not necessarily maybe ready for it, or that particular piece of the workflow isn't ready for it. It's also why I stress that kind of sandwich approach. Like, you don't have to have the full sandwich at the same time. You can introduce sort of lab automation, hardware and orchestration systems, and then you can layer on platforms like Ganymede once you're kind of ready for it, once you are generating enough data for that to kind of make sense. And then you can layer on DOEs once you have that, workflow more built out. So it's a difficult problem though, because it's kind of an art form, right? Like figuring out which part of your workflow is standardized enough that it would benefit from automation and not become, to Eric's point, something that you throw away, 1, 2, 3 years down the line.
Yeah, and it's also sometimes it's like a investment that you want to have like a long-term, return on. Matjaž, do you have anything to add from a sort of a data point?
Actually, I have maybe it's a question for Eric, a sub question. So do you see that there are any differences in challenges between, the size of the lab that wants to get automated? Talking about, let's say, a small lab working within a small to medium business, and a larger lab working within a larger company, perhaps even big pharma companies?
What I would say is there's less of a difference between the small or medium-sized labs to the large labs, and more of a difference between the small to medium-sized companies and the large companies. So I say that because the regulations or internal standardizations within a massive conglomerate, and we all know the names, those are much tighter, much more strict, much more nailed down than a company that's just starting off and has an interest in automation and wants to get started. There is just based on the amount of people you have to interact with, the amount of people you have to get signed off for any given task or design change, that's where I really see the difference. So based on the size of the lab, not necessarily. If we have a massive lab, let's say we have a hypothetical infinite amount of footprint to work with, it's really just incorporating different transportation technologies, whether that is a transfer track or the X-planer or a mobile robot, that's fine. But it's the same design, just scaled up or stretched out with those as fillers. When you're dealing with a massive company, there are so many factors beyond that that are more people-focused, I would say, people-centric than the technology-centric.
That's a great point. Coming back to people as well. Ginger, do you have anything to add to like what's being discussed here?
Yeah, it's funny. Some of the points I was going to raise were mentioned, right? And one in particular being to plan for 5 years from now and not tomorrow. It's kind of like a highway infrastructure build out, right? When you build out for the traffic today, and by the time it's done, you need another lane on the highway. I always educate customers on that, but I think more so to build off of what Eric's just said. Sometimes it can be too late, not too late, but sometimes people think that they have to wait until they get to a certain point in their process before they think, oh, now I can implement automation. And then all these SOPs are written and everything's already done and all of the design is already set. And then people are like, oh, it's too much work to try and automate now. I'm just going to continue to wash my plates by hand or do my pipetting or, walk around the lab myself. And so I personally think like it's never too early to start thinking about how you can automate your process. And also I think a little bit to Alan's point, like not everything can be automated, right? Like, some things are better left, as a walk-up liquid handler than, fully automating something. Sometimes things are just too complicated to implement full automation. And that's where, you can optimize with like orchestration, digitization and all of that to gain your efficiencies there. But yeah, plan well for the future because these things, don't die.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think we see that also in like electronic lab notebook kind of realm as well, is that like, if you're just starting, like, of course, if you're already existing and you're just transitioning, like you should do that as early as you can. But if you're just starting, like, it's always great to think about, an option like right away, because like by the time halfway through, you have a bunch of, boxes of paper and you're trying to transition to a digital option. Like, so that's something that we see as well. A lot of people recommend, like once they start using tool, they recommend others to really think about tools like that as early as possible. I want to give like maybe one last like point to make, Alan, if you want to make on this point before we move on to the next question, next topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think, maybe an undercurrent that I picked up on from this topic is that, you really need to pick your solutions kind of carefully for the problem that you're facing, the bottlenecks that you're facing. There isn't necessarily like a minimum size. We work with companies, from full multi-department kind of discovery to biomanufacturing, on the large size to like a 10-person company that just is leveraging automation in a very intelligent way, right? And they're able to do with 10 people what you might need 100 to do with. And so, I think another side of this is also the complexity of the workflows. And again, picking that right solution also has to do with making sure that it's open-ended enough and customizable enough to match your specific needs. So yeah,
right. So that flexibility, and you know, and we talk about the human factor, partnership, working together, sort of like placing a role here as well to kind of tackle those like common challenges that you see when it comes to automation. That start early, you know, find the right partner to work with on the automation, and make sure that the solution you choose is flexible and has, you know, opportunities for integrating with others, and ability to scale up. It sounds like that's kind of like some of the key points that we're covering here. Great. That's a great discussion, everyone. So that's really awesome. So I want to go to the next one, because we talk a little bit about this kind of throughout, how things need to integrate and talk to each other. So, oh, sorry. Things need to integrate and talk to each other. Now, for things to talk to each other, it's almost necessary to have some sort of standard, like it's almost like a common language, you know, like that you have to have equipment talk to, you know, like a platform, or talk to like a software or some kind of downstream kind of software there. So here's a question for you, Matjaž, to start. What kind of standards, you know, exists in the automation industry, like the, well, or the lack of standard, perhaps I should say, and what is the current, you know, situation, and you know, what are we looking at when it comes to how does that impact the labs who are looking at automation solutions, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe start off with the fact that there is no obvious single vendor agnostic or instrument agnostic standard out there, right? For I'm talking about exchange of data between lab instruments and the things. So maybe to start off with this, so I think everyone who's been working in the lab feels this, has know that there is no easy way to connect the instruments or data flows. But there have been quite a few or different attempts to, you know, standardize the data flows, and I'll talk a little bit also about automation, the standardizing the automation. So one approach was, you know, in the absence of standards, what to do? You attempt to create one, right? And there have been, I think, the biggest driver for creating or promoting the data exchange formats was large pharma. They have a lot of challenges, and they also have quite a few means, you know, a lot of resources. For example, those standards, I can mention a few, were allotrope foundations, the ADF, so the allotrope data format, ANYML, an XML-based, you know, analytical data storage and data exchange standard. Then the Pistoia Alliance, they are promoting their unified data model. And the first, so allotrope and UDM, were heavily, you know, promoted or sponsored by big pharma. And they also drive the types of instrumentation, right? They start with supporting the instrumentation that they have, that they're using. So this was, let's say, one approach. And the second approach was the fact that a lot of, you know, companies, so private companies, independent companies, started creating commercial platforms that try to fill this gap, right? To standardize the data flows between the instruments and whatever the sinks of the data were. When we actually have some platforms or some representatives of such platforms, you know, members of this webinar. So, for example, a Ganymede or Tetra Science or Cytera, those are the platforms that take care about, you know, take care about the data exchanges. And in addition to the standards that I mentioned before, they add some additional values, whether these are, you know, plugins with the LIMSes, ELNs, whether this is workflow building or orchestration, or already some data visualization or data analytics, data warehouses. So it's not just about data standardization. That every platform tries to, you know, add some additional benefit or functionality. And maybe the last part that I want to mention, so the third attempt of standardization are vendors, the instrument vendors themselves. They are building IoT platforms that are typically quite closed. For example, each major instrument manufacturer have their own platforms, such as Mettler Toledo has Labix, Thermo Fisher has Thermo Fisher Connect, Eppendorf has Visionize, Gilson has Gilson Connect, and so on. And these are then the partial, let's say, solutions that cover the instruments, that the connection between the instruments that these companies cover or produce. And they also add some additional functionalities like, I don't know, equipment management, scheduling, and so on. So to conclude, actually, there's quite a lot of different standards out there, if you want to mention it like that way. So there will always be some custom work that is needed to be done for, to truly connect whatever data flows that you have. So data from your sources to your sinks. So yeah, maybe that's.
That's great. Thanks, Matjaž. And it sounds like that there is efforts for standard, but it sounds like the realm is that it's not going to be a quick solution, and there is a lot of efforts more on the flexibility side of how platforms and instruments can connect and get it, keep it flexible and wide open. Ginger, do you want to add here? Anything here?
Yeah, sure. I can definitely weigh in here, because I know that there's the handful that Matjaž mentioned, and then also Sia as well in terms of standardization. But I do think that the more companies like Artificial, Ganymede, start to come on the market and really answer the industry's need for agnostic platforms, right? On the front end, even you're seeing with Biosero as well too, that it will start to trend in that direction. It's not as complicated as it was, today as it was previously, like early on in automation, in terms of how different platforms talk with different instruments and things like that. It used to be really complicated with a variety of different formats. Things are starting to standardize a little bit more on their own. And I think the more the industry needs it and wants it, the more it will drive in that direction. That's personally what I think. It just takes a while, right? I mean, scientists in general, or anybody doesn't like change, right? And so change happens a little bit more slowly when it comes even to instrumentation and software. It goes back a little bit to, if all your processes are set and everything else is done, why are you going to mess with it, right? And so the evolution here just takes a little bit longer to standardize, but I do think it's coming. This is a passionate topic of David Fuller, our CEO at Artificial, about this particular topic. I'm sure, Alan, you have just the same passion around it as well.
Yeah, sure. Happy to kind of jump in here. I think in a broader point, it's probably going to have to happen organically. I'm generally pessimistic about these kind of top-down approaches, and it'll be kind of needs-based driven, right? So I think us coming together as essentially vendors kind of in this space, building these software platforms, like we're already in discussions with each other about partnering and kind of offering the most comprehensive and fully integrated experience for our collaborators, right? So I think that focus on integration will help drive that kind of organic standardization that will come up. But more specifically, I mean, at Ganymede, we're very pessimistic about any kind of standardization. Our baseline assumption is that this space will be too complex to ever have any one standard. And we've kind of built a platform on the data side, at least for that data layer, around this idea, so it's very open-ended. Yeah, I mean, we don't rely on, we can incorporate some of these standards like allotrope and other kind of ontologies coming through. Like we're open enough to kind of incorporate them, but we don't kind of impose like one file type, say, on all the data that we're saving, et cetera. So we kind of see everything as data frames, just take all the kind of data from all these different instruments, parse them out and put them into structured tables that are open-ended enough that you can then integrate however you kind of need. So the level of standardization that we kind of focusing
Right.
on.
Good point. Good point. Yeah, I think this is a shifting goalpost almost like, and it's great to have like even Ganymede and SciNote, we're working on something that should be available in the next few months. So fingers crossed. And then if anyone's interested, contact us. But anyways, we're going to go into the next theme. I know this is standardization is something that there's a lot of discussion now. So maybe at the end, if we have time, we can go back to it. But this is actually a question that came up in our registration form, is that, and also something that we want to cover, which is what do you see? And in this forum, I think this attendees say the next 4 years very specifically. But of course, like what do we see in the coming years when it comes to trends and innovation? Now, we also, I think Ellen, you already covered a little bit about the fact that we're looking at the need-driven, kind of platform, that kind of base of solution in the coming years. So does anyone have anything else to add here? Eric, I will go to you first, actually. That's, what is the trends and innovation you're seeing in this automation realm going forward?
The two things I'd like to touch on here, one is relatively obvious. I think that moving forward, we're going to see major advancements as far as transportation options go. So seeing the impact that autonomous mobile robots have had just at the last few shows, the chatter around them, the way that people are reacting to them, I know that they tap into some, collective subconscious imagery of R2-D2 or WALL-E or whatever it may be. And that's why everyone gets excited. But they're also really practical in the long run if we can make them this seamless collaboration. So that's the obvious answer. The less obvious answer, I feel, is going to be a development or a major improvement in user experience and user interface or softwares and programs in the lab. I feel really strongly about this, but I think that what we have grown to accept as passable in the biotech and life sciences industry for user interface is mind-blowing. Because when you compare us to consumer tech, or even in some cases, industrial automation, it's such a different level. And we've, in the rest of our lives, whether it's our phone or our computers or our pads or touchscreens, we're so happy with it because it's so advanced. But then we go into a lab and we're dealing with stuff that, and this is not, I'm not trying to diminish any specific company, but sometimes it looks like it's out of the 90s, which blows my mind. And I think that these scientists, these lab techs, these managers deserve better than that. And I think that the industry is starting to react.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because I've talked to some of our users and they abandoned their previous solution to come to us because of user interface. Because at the end of the day, for them, at the end of the day, like features are check boxes that you can tick, but like if you're lab manager or your staff scientist just refuse to use the solution, it doesn't really do anything, right? And we're looking at investments, and return on investment too. So that's a great point, Eric.
And the other thing is that if we get to a point where most of these programs share common functionalities, the only determining factor will end up being which one you prefer to use, which one you enjoy using more.
That's a very good point. Perfect. And then Ginger, do you have anything? What is your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I feel like this might end up being a mini infomercial for everybody's platform.
Sorry, all the attendees. Sorry, everyone.
But obviously, I think from a digital lab perspective, just the ability to be able to access your entire workflow from the cloud, like wherever you are, is going to be hugely beneficial. I mean, we saw that even during the pandemic, and even before that. My previous company was one of the first robotic cloud lab, companies on the, in the space. And back then it was, really innovative in what Artificial is doing and what others are doing as well in the same space is trending in that direction. I think, aside from mobile robots, the hardware that we have will just make incremental improvements to that, and it really is going to come from the digitalization and being able to streamline your workflows and getting more out of what you have and from a more efficient perspective. that's, that's my perspective being at.
Right, of course, where it's going and what we're going to see in the next little while. Matjaž, can you chime in here when it comes to, the trends and innovation in the coming years?
Yeah, sure. So maybe again to mention that people are again at the center of of science, and we have to be aware, right, that also us humans are generating data. We are data generators, right? So I think it's obvious that for the instruments in lab, they are positioned in a lab, and the automation of workflows related to instruments is present in the lab. But when it comes to using the digital platforms such as ELNs or LIMS systems or whatever platforms that the humans have to interact with, these don't have a really good availability at the lab. So this is, I think, something that will be very crucial, and I think that will be also a game changer for us, the platforms through which users interact with while working in a lab. So enabling the ability for the platforms to be used at the lab, either it's smart furniture or mobility. So using everything, of course, in the cloud, but having it packaged in a mobile enough version so that we can interact with these platforms directly without having to use any proxy solutions and then to finish our work when we leave the lab. So I think that this is something that will also be a game changer.
Right. Good point. Alan, anything to add here when it comes to trends and innovations that we're seeing?
I think this is one that we've kind of talked about a couple of times, but the focus on integration, and it kind of ties into this amazing blog post from Andreessen Horowitz about sort of biotech's tech moment. There's a lot of digital platforms coming out right now trying to fix that kind of legacy feel, to Eric's point, and address some of the major problems. And a good chunk of them are dedicated to kind of automation, right? And all the different layers of automation and addressing them. And the key innovation / challenge, I think, will be and this is, again, part of the reason why we're even having this webinar, figuring out how do we all kind of work together and actually stick together these different platforms in a meaningful and useful, practical way, right? And then you can kind of get more specific, like, large language models, kind of using those I've seen them used to kind of paper the cracks or amplify specific digital platforms. So paper the cracks in terms of the integrations, or amplify in terms of, like, let's say, building out dashboards in a much easier way. So I've seen that on like the commercial digital platform side in pharma.
That's great. Thank you so much, Alan. All right, so that's everyone make notes, and we'll come back in 3 years and we'll regroup and see which one of these innovations and trends got realized 3 years from now. Make sure to register. I'll launch a registration, for online tomorrow. Anyways, just a joke aside. So now that we talk about, what we are hopefully going to see in the future, kind of setting the tone, like here's the background, what the challenge people can kind of see if they are interested in, automation and how they would tackle them. Let's go to maybe the next one, which is, if I'm a lab that's interested in getting started right now, and bear in mind that we're a bit short on time, so I want to make sure that all the speakers kind of be very highlight on this. How would labs get started right now? Like, what would be a good way for labs to get started, like right now, as the next step? And let's go to you, Eric, first. What do you think?
I think that as far as getting started, the golden rule is, do not get so excited that you jump into the deep end. Take it bit by bit, make sure that you have the absolutely essential part of your process that you want to have automated, and automate that. So whichever software you choose, and then the essential instruments, and just link that together with a robotic arm. That's it. Don't get drawn in by all the shiny things. Just make sure you start from there, and then you can scale up, because that's the beauty of a lot of these automation platforms, is they are designed to be scaled over time. It's not one and done.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And even when we're implementing an electronic lab node, that's what we tell people, like, start with the things that you're doing right now, or like something that you want to, like small scale, something that you want to get, some active projects that you're working on, and then slowly expand it into the whole company. So start like with what is critical. And I think that applies to a lot of things as well. Ginger, do you have anything to add? How do people get started?
Yeah, the only thing I would say about what Eric just said was to make sure that whatever they do get can be expanded and grown, right? Especially if they don't know what the future holds. I think that there was a question in Q&A about like, if you only have funding for like a year or two, how can you plan for 5 years out? And it's about making the best choice, like a really informed, educated choice on those first few pieces of equipment that you purchase, or even software platforms that you purchase, to make sure that they are scalable, right? And that you don't potentially buy a black box that will need to be phased out because you're no longer running that assay, or your science changes, right? Or your approach changes. And from a more practical perspective, just buy the liquid handler. I think every lab can benefit from a liquid handler. I honestly, and if people are still plate washing by hand, I think that they could just do that too. But that's from a more practical perspective.
No, that's still a very good point. I remember back in the days trying to fill a, 96 wheel plate
Right.
by hand.
Yep.
That was not a fun project. Anyways, Alan, do we want to go to you next?
Yeah, I guess I'll echo kind of Ginger's point, and this is a point we made it a little bit earlier, that the costs have come down. So you can get actually pretty narrow now in terms of the application of automation. It used to be this kind of big system being implemented in your company, and it had to be X amount of people and so on. But now you can, it's as simple as getting a kind of liquid handler. And I remember when I co-founded the Center for Epigenetics Research at Sloan Kettering, it was a team of 3 people, but we leveraged automation. And leverage, I think, is the key word here. Know where, identify those bottlenecks, and know where you can actually have leverage from automation. So we had a liquid handler. We had this, it was a liquid handler designed specifically for like epigenetics reactions. So we could just run them overnight, so I can kind of increase my productivity instead of hiring additional people. And then we also had like the bioinformatics pipelines that we kind of build out to kind of automate that analysis step. So, and that allowed us to get through thousands of samples with just 3 people. So.
Excellent. That's a good point. Matjaž, you next, and then we're gonna go to some questions after you. Okay.
Yeah. So I think I'll just continue the train of thoughts. So classical. This can be seen as a classical. So automation can be seen as a conventional digitization challenge, right? So it's really important that you prioritize very well, right? So like we said, don't jump into the deep end. So really identify what, shortlist, whether it's instruments, the data sources that are biggest bottlenecks for your processes, either the causes of the largest inefficiencies or human errors in your processes, and start from them, prioritize them. And then, when you're looking at the either software platforms or automation platforms, check how many boxes, your priority list overlaps with the functionalities that these platforms offer. And yeah, that would be also maybe my last thought for this topic, prioritize.
That's a good point. That's actually segued quite well into our next section, which is the Q&A. Thank you all the panelists for your insights, and we're gonna start with the Q&A, and if we can open up the chat for interaction, that would be great as well. I kind of want to follow Matjaž, what Matjaž just mentioned, prioritizing. And our first question from one of the attendees is that, and Ginger touched on this a little bit. If you only have funding for 1 or 2 years, like of course you have planning out for the future. If you only have funding for a short period of time, how do you make the case for companies to invest in a solution? Like if you have to make an argument, okay, we're gonna see the return on investment in this period of time or something. How do you make that sort of case for the leadership to buy in on this really? And what can you present? And I see Eric, you nodding your head. So hopefully I saw it correctly. If you have any suggestions and thoughts for this?
Yeah, real quick. I think that the idea is not to spend the money up front and then have to spend it again in 5 years. That was in no way the point. I think the idea is just, if you reach a point where you're ready to continue scaling, that's when you do it. And as far as getting the funds together and justifying the ROI, it's not just a matter of throughput. Throughput is at the core of any automated system, right? You want to improve that. You love the idea of being able to run processes through the night or over a weekend, something like that. But it goes beyond that, and it gets into repeatability and accuracy and just scalability over time. And that's where you see the true ROI. This is not something that is a gimmick. Automation is not and will never be a gimmick. And this is something that they need to see as the necessary next step as we progress towards all future processes.
Very good point. Thank you, Eric. I do want to chime in also a little bit from sorry, I also have a perspective, which is that sometimes we look at this and we also look at how, you know, if you're looking for a shorter return on investment, how having a vendor who's willing to work closely with you and provide the support you need is pretty critical. Because if you have a vendor who just like, here is a solution, and then kind of walk away from that, right? That will drag on your implementation time, drag on your onboarding time, and you know, make it very difficult to see that ROI in a shorter period of time with in 1 to 2 years. So finding someone who, and you know, and also like all the panelists is here, we're here because we're interested in those kind of like collaboration, partnership ideas, and also when it comes to like support, like that's kind of like the philosophy. So yeah, so I think that's also playing an important role. Anyone else want to chime in? I think Ellen, you have interest in talking about it.
Yeah. I mean, there's kind of, in some ways, cost savings up front, because we've really, you know, across the board here, productized, right? Things that you may otherwise have to build in-house just to be able to really have that healthy kind of pipeline of products, of therapeutics, for example. So it's really a kind of cost savings in many ways, right? Like we've already kind of done that work, we've built it out. Instead of you having to hire a team of maybe software engineers, automation engineers, et cetera, that can actually get quite expensive. And I think another way of looking at it is to be much more forward thinking of, you know, if you do have, and just to Eric's point about reproducibility and one I made earlier, it's a reflection of the healthiness kind of that pipeline and the healthiness of your company, right? If you're able to introduce successfully automation systems, it's a lever you can use to maybe secure more funding, which I think is not really used quite often. People get so narrow on like, well, which therapeutics do I have in the pipeline? But
Right.
you know, frankly, 90% of them will fail in clinical trials, right? It's more about having that system in place for eventually, let's say, finding that therapeutic that will make it through clinical trials, that I think puts you in a much better position funding wise. So.
Okay, sounds good. That's a good point, to leverage that to like secure, you know, additional investment down the road. So those are really great points. Thank you all. I have one question that's actually from a registration form and from a submission. This is a really practical one. I know that when we were discussing this earlier, that we're all like, oh, Ellen is the one to go to. So this question is, do you have any recommendations for how to ease the transfer of databases from informal Excel, etc., to centralized format, for example, SQL, during the scale-up stage for both the data management teams and end users? I think, you know, we talk about you, Ellen, you know, when we discuss this question, but I think there are other speakers can chime in later on as well. Do you want to get started maybe a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the quickest, most kind of self-serving, obvious one is to use Ganymede, you know, so our pipelines and our platform, they're built exactly for this kind of transfer. I kind of mentioned it before. It's really our bread and butter, parsing out Excel files, you know, loading them into a database, being able to then run kind of SQL queries. You know, from the data management team perspective, you know, our platform, we allow you, again, that idea of customization, we allow you to configure, reconfigure those pipelines however you like to match your workflows. We're never going to assume we're the experts and understand complexity of your science and processes. So we'd rather give you the tool to be able to kind of do that and supply that infrastructure so you don't have to build it from scratch. And then from the end user's perspective, you know, you can upload those informal, if you will, files for automatic kind of processing. So afterwards, once we've structured that data, you can then kind of run analysis at scale. So whether that be kind of manual analysis, or you can even leverage automation for analysis. And we've shown that a couple of different ways. So.
Right, that's a good point. I remember also that like for some of the other things, like I mean, for us at least, we see a lot of even more informal, which is not even Excel. It's like transferring data from paper notebooks and or potentially other ELN to SciNote or Excel or Word document. Like Matjaž, do you have anything to add here? When it comes to, I remember we had conversations about mapping data and the importance of that when it comes to, automation processes. Can you add something there?
I mean, this is really a tough one, right? So either use, like Ellen said, either use some platform or really have a good data scientist, right? That will help you either create, I don't know, your own I don't know, data lake, or use some other platform to do that. It really depends how varied your data inputs are, but there's, I think, quite a lot of automation platforms out there. So if you don't have a data scientist there, my next suggestion would be, check out the platforms.
Right, good point. Which segue into another question as well. There's the argument for buying an existing software solution. There's also the argument of let's have a team build a solution that's custom made for the company. And sometimes you need to kind of make the case for either or. And what scenario will one work better than the other? Or do you for people here, and obviously we're all software providers, so I get that, but is there anything that on more of a general level, like what would be your recommendation? And Ginger, would you like to start with that? I see you unmute yourself, so I figure that's
well, I think any software provider is going to have homegrown or home built as their biggest competitor. And I think, from customers who have gone that route and come to us even after, it's mostly because theirs isn't scalable, really, right? It can potentially not be scalable, I'll say. It doesn't mean that that's, across the board, but a lot of the times their own IT groups won't let them deploy further throughout the organization, because it doesn't have it's not what they do every day, right? They were doing it to solve a problem because like a solution, a commercially available solution didn't exist, right? And now those do exist, and so leave it to the experts usually, right? And then you can save your software teams or your teams internally to develop other solutions that they need. Right. And that's what I've heard from customers. And I just think the value add that any of us bring to the table is that this is what we do. Right. And we can leave, the scientists in the biotech and pharma companies to, really focus on their science.
That's great to know. Thank you so much. That's a very good point. And thank you, Ginger. So there is also one more question that's very specific to SciNote. So I think, Matjaž, you're going to answer that privately, but I do want to expand on that actually, because there is a question about, implementing SciNote in a GMP environment. So my question actually, expanding on that more broadly, to all the panelists here, given we still have a few more minutes, how does this whole automation landscape play out when it comes to more of a regulated or, like a compliance environment where a lot of the biotech and, pharmaceutical companies, are in to meet? And we'll start with Matjaž, perhaps, like, what are your thoughts? Like, what are these processes? Like, do they add to it? Do they make it more difficult? Like, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so it's so using any kind of software solution or automation solution in any type of regulated environment, whether it's a GMP, GLP, or something else, adds to the level of complexity and also adds to the level of service that the automation platform or software needs to provide, right? So it is very clear that this is the software, so the vendors need to have their platforms validated, that the platforms need to have a very clear audit trails of all actions that users perform with them. So traceability is extremely important. Data security is extremely important. the functionalities that ensure the retention of records. So this becomes very important. Electronic signatures, these types of functionalities then become important in GMP or GLP regulated environments. So I think that the companies who are offering their services to these types of environments, they if they do not have these functionalities, they drop off very quickly off the shortlist through the selection process. So yeah,
that's a good point. I also feel like automation actually also helped this process because of the fact that you kind of, I mean, we say that humans are important, but at the same time, some of the automated processes kind of make sure that like you prevent some of the more errors that can happen during the transition from one platform or one source to another, right? Does anyone else have anything else you would like to add? Feel free to unmute yourself. I mean, this is our last question, so anyone else have anything to add here when it comes to using automation solutions in the regulated environment? Matjaž kind of summarizes everything for you all.
Yeah, I can also add maybe something that's often forgotten is that yeah, of course the platforms have to be up to certain standards, but the also equally important part needs to be done then on the end user. So compliance happens on both ends, right? So in the end, every automation is part of the processes, and this have to be validated as well. So there's a certain amount of work in the lab environment that's responsible, that the end users are responsible to provide.
Thank you, Matjaž. Okay, I think we're at time here. So thank you everyone for joining us. I want to share the last slide. Make sure, please remember to fill out the survey. The link is in the chat. And also we will be sending out an email to thank you, but we also provide all the speakers' contact information inside the email. So if you would like to reach out to any of the speakers to explore automation solutions they offer, please feel free to connect with any of us and we'll be happy to help. I want to thank all the speakers for joining us today, and also thank you all for all the attendees actually for joining this and sharing your questions with us. And make sure to fill out the survey so that we know what we can, maybe we'll do this again in a few months, or and to revisit automation solution, and maybe we'll narrow down on even one of the topics in the future. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time.